what I got there. That was right.
Yeah. Okay, so kind of to give a rundown of where we're at. Esther is the third of the three books of history that we have that deal with the post-exile. Okay, if you'll recall, Chronicles goes through and kind of mentions the end of the exile, but that's where it stops. And then Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther are the three books that actually give us post-exile details. Now, Esther is actually earlier than, not of all the events, but the events of Esther would have happened before Ezra and Nehemiah came to Jerusalem. So this would have been earlier than that. This is about 460, 468 BC. And then Ezra and Nehemiah are 450, 440. So, and remember that in BC we count down, which is always fun to try to remember. So there are kind of two reasons this is brought up. First of all is to see this moment of protection. It is also the impetus for one of the Hebrew celebrations. If you'll remember when we went through Deuteronomy, we mentioned the 6 main feast days. Well, at this point, there is another one that is added called Purim. And this is the events of Esther are the beginning of that particular event. Purim has a verbal discussion of lots. Okay. And the reason is because what they were protected from involved the casting of lots. And we'll kind of see where that is going. We don't know who wrote it. There's not even a guess. So it's kind of important to understand that. Could have been Mordecai. It could have just been a Jew that was in the area at the time. We really don't know. Probably written somewhere around 460 BC. And is written to record the events of this particular incident. The key verse is found in Esther chapter 4, verse 14. And it says, for if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this. Okay. This is it's probably the most well-known verse out of Esther, but really is kind of the central theme of the whole thing. I mentioned last week, Esther is the only book in the Old Testament that never mentions the name of God once. His name never comes up a single time. However, as you read Esther, you see his presence all over the place. Okay. In some ways, it feels a little like Ruth does. Now, Ruth mentions God and mentions God's involvement far more than Esther does. But if you'll recall, when we were going through Ruth, we saw several times it goes, and it happened that she went to this field. And it just so happened that it was Boaz's field. And it just so happened that Boaz came to visit that day. And it just so happened that he noticed her. And it just so happened that, okay. And we talked a little bit about that idea of coincidence. And Esther really kind of doubles down on that. It never mentions God's activity, but if you're looking for it, you can definitely see God's activity. Okay. Now, so let's go ahead and get into the actual book itself. In chapter 1, we get this idea, and it says, now in the days of Ahasuerus, okay, and that is how they will name him throughout the book. History knows him as Xerxes. Okay, Ahasuerus would be his Hebrew, what the Hebrews called him. That'd be kind of the Hebrew version of his name. We know him as Xerxes. Okay, which also helps us understand some of the events that are going on. So, Xerxes it appears that this banquet that is such a big deal here in chapter 1 is a banquet that is a prelude to a military campaign. Okay, Xerxes had two major campaigns in his life against the Greeks. And, well, sorry, his dad did first, Darius, and then Xerxes went later, and they both lost. But what is probably going on here is either just before or just after this event, either he's throwing a party to kind of assuage a defeat, or he's trying to build up support for the military effort that's going to happen. But no matter which one of those it is, what happens is there's a huge feast. Now, let me make sure you understand. The word here, the Hebrew word for feast, really means drinking binge or something similar to that. Okay, so it would have been, it was a week-long binge, a week-long party with every expense, wine flowing like water, food, and all of this stuff. In fact, the whole thing was about 6 months long, and at the end comes this 7-day feast. So they have a 6-month-long celebration, and then at the end they have this huge feast for everybody. The king has all of, basically how this works, the king has all the men at his feast, and then the queen has all the women at kind of a separate party. Okay, a week into this feast, and they are very drunk and not thinking very clear. By the way, it says, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, so he was heavily intoxicated. He commands the eunuchs, and this is an important element here. In Persian culture, the eunuchs, these would have been the queen's attendants on behalf of the king. And they were eunuchs to ward from happening. So they had been, to be a eunuch meant they had been castrated. That is literally what that phrasing means. Okay. To go get the queen and tell her to come out, and the way this was worded is she's to come and entertain his guests and show off. And basically, he wants to show how beautiful she is by having her come out in only her crown. So he wants her to prance naked in front of all of his guests, so that he can show how beautiful his wife is. Okay. It is not in totally clear, but clearly in verse 11, it says to bring Queen Vashti before the king with her royal crown. And there was definitely, even if it wasn't for her to be naked, it was to show her off and to show her like a prize mare at a horse show is the idea. Well, Queen Vashti refuses to come. Now, here is the interesting thing. The way this is phrased in Esther clearly says that the writer of Esther thinks that what the queen did was honorable, that she made the right decision. Okay? Because it doesn't give any, it doesn't give any, it doesn't make any attempt to justify the king's position. It's just she refuses and he gets angry. So while he's angry, he goes to his wise men and says, well, what do we need to do here? And they decide to make her a example, because they say, and literally at the end of chapter 1, it goes, well, king, this is not just against you. Every woman in the kingdom will start to disobey her husband. You've got to make an example. It's fun. It goes, watch. Let me find it. For the queen's behavior will be made known to all women, causing them to look at their husbands with contempt. Since they will say, well, King Ahasuerus commanded Queen Vashti to be brought before him, and she did not come. You got to punish her so that every marriage in the kingdom doesn't fail. It's really ridiculous, but it is how this works. So they banish her. They banish her somewhere outside of the kingdom, and she lives there alone. She can never come back to the king. Okay. It goes on. It says he sent letters to all the royal provinces. This is the last verse of chapter 1. To every province in its own script, and to every people in its own language, that every man be master in his own household and speak according to the language of his people. So make sure you keep your wives in line. That's really fun. Okay. Chapter 2. We go forward 2 or 3 years. Probably 3, because the next events happen, the next time frame, year of Esther's. So takes a couple years for Xerxes' anger to bear down, and he goes, man, she was really pretty. I wish she was back. Well, they can't do that. So they go, I've got an idea. Here's the idea. So let's hold a beauty pageant. I mean, literally. Now, it is a little bit more than that, though. Literally, they are going to take all the prettiest virgin daughters in the entire kingdom and basically kidnap them. I mean, I want to be understanding of what they are all going to enter into the king's harem, and they're going to be stuck there for the rest of their lives, whether the king likes them or not. So they go and find the prettiest girls in the entire kingdom, and they bring them all to the capital, and they begin a process here. One of them is a Jew, okay, named Esther. Now, the way it introduces first is it introduces first Mordecai. Mordecai is a Jew in Susa. He is, and his niece, okay, was named Esther, and she was very, very beautiful. And she ends up being one of the women taken. Okay. And what it goes on to tell us is they take them, and for a year, they spend a year getting a year-long makeover is basically how this works. They spend 6 months getting oil and all this sort of stuff, and then spices, and to make them the most absolutely beautiful they can make them. I laugh. My wife occasionally watches those, Dallas Cowboy cheerleader making the team things, and it sounds a bit like that. Okay. And so it tells us that after a year, then one at a time, they would send them into the king for an evening. And we don't have to ask what went on there. And then they were sent to the second of the harem places and didn't know whether they would ever see the king again. But here's the thing. They had been with the king, so they couldn't marry anyone else. Their potential for a husband was over. So it really is a pretty grotesque process that they're explaining that Esther is being put through. But what we see is, in much the same way as we discussed Daniel, in much the same way as we discussed Nehemiah and Ezra, we see a wisdom in her that is beyond the norm. Because it tells us that whenever it comes time for her to go in before the king, she takes the advice of the head of the harem. Now, how does that work? Well, he's the guy who knows what the king likes. He has been in charge of all the king's concubines for all these years. And she listens to sound advice, and she goes in, and it says that he loves her more than any of the others. And he immediately decides, oh yeah, this is my queen. Okay. So we have gone from up to the middle of chapter 2, we have covered 4 years, because it tells us that it is in the 7th year of Xerxes' reign that she becomes queen. So 4 years has passed from the sacking of Queen Vashti. Okay. So 4 years has gone. Then in verse 19, it says that now when the virgins were gathered together the second time, Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate. Esther had not made known her kindred or her people as Mordecai had commanded her. For Esther obeyed Mordecai just as when she was brought up by him. In those days, as Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bigthan and Teresh, 2 of the king's eunuchs who guarded the threshold, became angry and sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. And this came to the knowledge of Mordecai, and he told it to Queen Esther. And Esther told the king in the name of Mordecai. When the affair was investigated and found to be so, the men were both hanged on the gallows. And it was recorded, by the way, mark this verse down. And it was recorded in the book of the Chronicles in the presence of the king. Esther chapter 2, the end of verse 23. Okay. Now, the reason I tell you to mark that down is that's going to come up again. Okay. So after these things, so in chapter 3, we meet the villain. Okay. So now we've met the king, we've met the heroes, and now we meet the villain. We meet Haman. And Haman is egotistical, and the king has made some comment about, him being worshipped because he's second in command, but Mordecai refuses to bow before him. And basically the idea is, I bow only to my God and my king. He chooses not to bow. This angers Haman, and Haman has a drastic overreaction. There's no other way to say it. He decides, well, I'm so mad at Mordecai for not bowing to me. Not only am I going to kill Mordecai, I'm going to kill everybody who's related to Mordecai. I'm going to wipe the entire Jewish nation off the map because Mordecai made me mad. Now, there is one other thing that we need to know about Haman. It tells us Haman is an Agagite. An Agagite. Most scholars believe that what that means is he is a descendant of King Agag. Agag was the king of the Amalekites who Saul didn't kill and Samuel did. Remember, God told Saul, wipe out the Amalekites completely, and Saul was not obedient. Well, the king was named Agag. And so there is a strong possibility that that Haman is a descendant of the Amalekites who would have been arch enemies to Israel anyway. And we're seeing God continue to bring this hatred between them. Okay. But no matter what the reason is, he decides he's going to just work out killing the entire Jewish nation. So, by the way, we've moved forward another 5 years because this is now the 12th year of King Xerxes. They cast lots to decide what month and what day they're going to have this genocidal event. Okay. Then he goes to the king and says, hey, there's this group of people that are not loyal to you. They have different culture. They want to believe in their own God. They have all these things. And I think we need to wipe them out. So verse 9 of chapter 3 says, if it pleases the king, let it be decreed that they be destroyed. And I will pay 10,000 talents of silver into the hands of those who have charge of the king's business, that they may put it into the king's treasury. Now let's get into this discussion. A talent is about 75 pounds. That is a lot of gold, a lot of silver. I'll give you a bunch of money too. And the king goes, okay, sounds good. So they make this decree. And if they wrote something into the law, even the king couldn't change it. Why that is, I don't know. But it literally says that if the king signs a decree, he can't unsign the decree, which does not seem to be a very good system. But that is the system. Okay. Chapter 4, Mordecai learns about it. Okay. And it says immediately he begins to mourn. He puts on sackcloth and ashes, goes out in the midst of the city, and he cries out with a loud and bitter cry. And all the Jews join. Okay. So one of Esther's maidservants comes and says, hey, Mordecai's acting weird. He's got sackcloth and ashes on and he's wailing around in the street and we don't know what's going on. So Esther goes to find him. He calls for one of the eunuchs and goes and gets Mordecai. And Mordecai comes back and tells him all that has gone on, this threat against the Jewish people. And he says, look, you've got to go into the king and beg for favor and beg him to turn this off, to not do this. But Esther points out a rule that she's living under is this: you don't go see the king unless he calls you. And she goes, it's been almost a month since I've been called into the king's chamber. And if I go without permission, I can be executed on the spot. Okay, so they tell Mordecai this, and Mordecai sends back, and then we come to this central verse of the whole book. Okay, I'm going to read the whole thing. They told Mordecai what Esther had said. Then Mordecai told them to reply to Esther. Do you think to yourself that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews? For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place. But you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this. Then Esther told them to reply to Mordecai, go gather all the Jews to be found in Susa and hold a fast on my behalf and do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my young women will also fast as you do. Then I will go to the king, though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish. Mordecai then went away and did everything as Esther had ordered him. Okay, now I want to remind you of the time frame here. I want to kind of push this. We are now 8 to 9 years from when Queen Vashti left. Esther has been in the king's household for about 6 years, and she's been queen for 5 years. Okay, there has already been one time where she has saved the king's life through Mordecai, or Mordecai saved the king's life through her. There has been a lot of things going on. She's not brand new to the queenship. So what we see, even though, once again, his name is never mentioned, we see God setting this up years in advance for this moment, which is why that phrasing is so important. Maybe you were brought here for this time, for this moment. God has already done all this in her life to get her to this place. So chapter 5 then goes, on the third day, Esther put on her royal robes, stood in the inner court of the king's palace in front of the king's quarters, while the king was sitting on his royal throne inside the throne room opposite the entrance to the palace. And when the king saw Queen Esther standing in the court, she won favor in his sight, and he held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand. So she steps into the royal chamber against the rules while he's holding court. So there would have been other important people around. And when he saw her, he had a choice. He could have ordered her to be executed on the spot, or he could hold out his scepter and welcome her in. And he does the second. Because, like I said, doesn't mention his name, but because God had given her favor in his sight. And so he goes, well, what is it, Queen Esther? What would you like? It shall be given to you, even if it's half my kingdom. So he's deeply in love with her. Or his favor is incredible. And she says, well, if it pleases the king, let the king and Haman come today to a feast that I have prepared for the king. Well, I'd like to invite you to dinner. So she still doesn't broach the subject yet. But she says, hey, husband, I want to invite you to dinner. And he immediately agrees, and he gets Haman. And they come to dinner. And so they go in and they have dinner. And the king goes, so you've brought me here for dinner. This must mean you want something. What is it you want? I'll give you anything. And she goes, well, I just want you to come back for dinner again. Come back tomorrow. So here is the fun part of this. And like I said, it is the beauty of how God works. Haman leaves Esther's house, leaves Esther's apartment or however, and goes, I need to get this all set up. So he orders for a rapidly built hangman station to be built. And it's built rather quickly. Okay. And so he had the gallows made on that very night. So the king has left Esther's, and he goes in and goes to bed, and he can't sleep. He's having trouble sleeping. And so he gave orders. This sounds so weird. He basically orders, if we were to look at a court today, he basically orders the court reporter to come and read out the list of things that have happened in the kingdom for the last 18 months. So at 6:42, so-and-so came into the office. And I mean, this is literally, he orders the scheduler to come and read to him. I'm sure that would put you to sleep. Okay. And it was found written, so it just so happened, remember those words? That the guy goes, let's see, 8:52. Esther comes in and tells you that Mordecai has discovered a plot on your life. Oh. Now watch. Hold on. Back in chapter, what was it? Chapter 2? I told you to write it down. Let's see. And it was recorded in the book of the Chronicles in the presence of the king, right after Esther became queen. So suddenly we've gone forward 4 or 5 years. This is not yesterday. This is in the years. And the king goes, did we ever give Mordecai anything for that? Hold on. No, doesn't show in here that we did anything. He saved my life. I guess we probably should do something for him. And so he calls Haman in. And it is, I promise there's a level in the story where this is one of the most beautiful moments of somebody getting what they deserve ever. Because he goes, Haman, I have a guy that I'm really, he did something really incredible for me, and I want to honor him. And Haman immediately, in his arrogance, goes, Oh, he must be talking about me. And so Haman what should we do for him? He goes, okay, here's what we should do. All right, here we go. Haman says to the king, for the man who the king delights to honor, let royal robes be brought, which the king has worn, and the horse that the king has ridden, and on whose head a royal crown is set. And let the robes and the horse be handed over to one of the king's most noble officials, and let him dress the man whom the king delights to honor, and let them lead him on the horse throughout the square of the city, proclaiming before him, thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor. So Haman is going, well, I'll get to wear the king's crown and the king's robe and ride the king's horse, and just everybody will get to know just how much the king loves me. The king says to Haman, hurry, take the robes and the horse as you have said, and do so to Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the king's gate. Leave out nothing that you have mentioned. So not only does he have to take the robe and all that, but he apparently had to be the guy who walked around going, isn't he great? Now, here is the situation, and this is very, very important. Okay. We see this moment. It says in verse 12 of chapter 6, it says, then Mordecai returned to the king's gate, but Haman hurried to his house, mourning and with his head covered. And Haman told his wife Zerah and all his friends everything that had happened. Then his wise men and his wife Zeresh said to him, if Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of the Jewish people, you will not overcome him, but will surely fall before him. So he's had somebody go, this is not going well for you. So Haman then has to, and by the way, understand the timing. Haman now has to hurry off to the feast with Esther. And let's be fair, he had to be steaming. Okay. By the way, verse 14, while they were yet talking with him, the king's eunuchs arrived and hurried to bring Haman to the feast. So they are still talking about how this has not gone well when the eunuch shows up and goes, hey, time to go. So they have another feast. And the king has once again kind of become merry with wine. And once again, what is your wish, Queen Esther? It shall be given to you, even to half of my kingdom. Then Queen Esther says, and this is the moment, just, if I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it pleases the king, let my life be granted me for my wish and my people for my request. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. If we were sold merely as slaves, men and women, I would have been silent, for our affliction is not compared with the loss to the king. Then King Ahasuerus says to Queen Esther, who is he and where is he that has dared to do this? A foe and an enemy. This guy. This wicked Haman. Then Haman was terrified before the king and queen. Now we come back to this full circle. Haman eventually is hung from the very gallows he was making for Mordecai. Okay. But there are still a couple of details that need to be dealt with. Remember, I said that if a decree is made by the king, it can't be taken back. He can't overturn the decree to have them attack the Jews. So this is what he does. He says, well, I'll do this edict. Instead, he at the behest of Esther, he makes an edict that on the day that had been decided that would happen, that the Jews were legally allowed to defend themselves. Okay, so understand there's a really bold move in what Haman did. If the Jews had not been allowed to defend themselves by the king, then if they tried to defend themselves, then the guards would have stepped in. So no matter what happened, they would have been accused of rebellion and wiped out. but by the king now saying they can't attack first, but they can defend themselves, and it takes the guards out of it. It takes the army out of it. It takes the kingdom itself out of it. And so what happens is then it gives the Jews a chance. In chapter 9, it tells us that we come to the point where this is all supposed to happen, and the Jews just rout it. They killed like 75,000 people who tried to attack them. Okay, they literally just they just destroy these people who attack them. And so the nation is saved. And by the way, we're thinking mainly Persia, but this would have included the Jews in Jerusalem. This would have included the Jews everywhere in the entire kingdom. So this is a lot of people. So they gather together, they have a feast, and this begins this idea of having a feast for this particular event, which is the Feast of Purim. Okay. It says Mordecai recorded all that had happened and sent it to all the Jews, obliging them to keep the 14th day of the 12th month of the year and the 15th day every year, and to have it as in a celebration. Okay. And then we go on, we see Queen Esther come back into the story a little bit, and then the fact that Mordecai ends up taking the place that Haman had held before. So we have in the placement of Xerxes a Jew who is standing as second in command of the whole kingdom, and of course the queen. So we see God elevate them. Okay, so we went through the story, but let me make sure we understand. What are we looking at? We are looking at the idea that even when God is not mentioned, he is still moving. And God is defending his people from their enemies in a incredibly specific way. See, the Jews are already, a large group of the Jews are already in Jerusalem, but the walls haven't been rebuilt. The city's still kind of in ruins. I think the temple has been built by this point, but still kind of in ruins. But God gives them victory over all their enemies. And we get to see from the perspective of Persia what God did to defend his people all over the kingdom through basically one guy and his niece who happens to become queen. See, it's very powerful in the discussion, and even as part of the discussion of how women are viewed in the Bible and how women are viewed in the culture of the day, to say, yeah, a woman saved us all. We all owe our lives to her. But that's exactly what the situation is. Now, a lot of what we've looked at and that does not apply here. This is not, no one in this story is in the lineage of Jesus. It's none of that is going on. What is going on is that as risk comes to the people who, remember, are where they are because of sin, God has not given up on them. And he uses the most interesting and sometimes unbelievable ways to fix the issues of his people, including one probably very young but very brave woman. And she saved her entire people because she was willing to step up. All right, we're going to stop there. We will pick up with Job next time. We will probably not go through Job the way we've gone through the others. There's a lot of poetry. We'll go through major if you've ever read through Job, and I encourage you to do so, the first 2 chapters are story, and then after that, it's all poetry. But at the same time, it is an incredible book of what God does in the lives of his people. So we will pick up there next time. And hey, look at that. That's 2 weeks in a row we got done early.